And another thing that I often did, and the kids seemed to love it, was I would have them put their initials on the board, and then I would make a cartoon out of their initials. Out of their initials, yeah. It could be an elephant or a rhinoceros or an elephant or all kinds of stuff. The fox, princess, all kinds of things out of their initials. And they had to put all three initials up, not just one. And then I would turn that into a cartoon. That's kind of an offshoot on the squiggle thing, where I would have kids make a squiggle with a magic marker or just a line, maybe a curvy line. And I'd turn it into something, some part of the composition or something. They sure like to watch me draw. But the teachers were really interested sometimes. How in the woods you get all the kids to do their homework? And what? Why is that unusual? She said, you had every one of those papers in. How did you do it? Well, I bribed them. No, cartoon drawing. Um, in my way of doing it, what happens is that I look at the squiggle or whatever, and before I even start, what I'm going to be drawing is on the paper. All I have to do is trace around the lines. So if I look at this guy and he's going to have a top hat, well, before I even touch the paper with my pencil, I've made room for this, and this line is going to be this part of the top hat, and the top hat's going to be sitting on a rabbit, or that kind of stuff. But the finished product is already there on the paper. That's all. Don't have to invent anything. Yeah, that's kind of the. But then the kids would, that was part of the thing too. Sometimes we'd do that. They'd have a squiggle, and one of the things they did with little kids, is we'd start up with a squiggle, and then this kid would add this part, and next kid would add another part, and the squiggle would turn into something other than what they had started out with. It may have looked like a swan at first, but now it's a fairy princess or something. And that was kind of fun too to do that. That's part of visualization type lessons. How do you see? How do you know what's there? Well, practice. Use your imagination. What do you see here? Does this look like a nose? Yeah. Oh, then we could do this and this and this and have a real face, couldn't we? Yeah, that could be a funny face too, wouldn't it? Okay. Um, that kind of stuff was important, for the art kids. But most of the stuff that I did was a distraction with the kids, and it was a thing. It was a thing to fill up the dead spots in an hour, or a day. To have the kids finishing working on a lesson, and then 3 or 4 of them have finished it completely, and there's 10 minutes left. What? What? Then you have problems if you don't challenge them in other ways. And a lot of times the kids were just, when they saw what the other kids were doing, they wanted to do it too, and so they got on the project and finished the assignment. So they could do that. They wanted to be able. I had a bag of tricks with me all the time. Yeah. Well, I remember doing that when I was teaching sixth grade in Sunnyside, and I used that scribble with the Harris kids when I was visiting over their house, and I would entertain those kids for hours. They would make scribbles, and I'd make things out of them, and it was kind of fun. They still remember to this day. But that's always been something I've done. When did I start doing that? When I was student teaching fourth grade, I think is when I started that with kids. and this weekly reader was the next subject that I was going to do after they finished the time on math. And I looked, and here it was about mountain men. And of course, it didn't have a whole long time. It was only about, I don't know, 150 words long, the whole story with pictures and everything. And I started drawing this mountain man trapper leading his horse, coming full size as far as the blackboard was concerned. Here he was leading his pack animal with all these pack and traps. He was walking, carrying his flintlock and all that sort of thing. Well, I labeled everything, the horse and the traps and the coonskin cap and the moccasins and everything, but I misspelled it all. And the point was simply that during this particular time when Lewis and Clark were coming through here, Webster hadn't made his dictionary, so there wasn't just one way to spell a word, and these kids were bouncing up and down to be the ones that corrected the spelling, after they figured out the game. Then, some of the things, when I did a second grade classroom, and I drew this great blue Pete's dragon on the board, and it took me all day to draw it. Every time the kids had a moment where they were doing something I was drawing up there, I had absolutely no problem with discipline, and the office people were always amazed with that. But anyway, and that was because these kids were never left on their own thing. They were always fascinated with what was making. Well, anyway, after I finished doing that Pete's dragon on the board, and I drew over his claws, and he was picking his teeth with his little finger claw, and he would end at the end of the day. He said, "I like second graders best," and but they wouldn't let the teacher erase that for a whole week. It had to stay up on the board. They had an in-building workshop type thing, and so the workshop people worked with the kindergarten and first grade teachers, so there were substitutes for that. And then kindergarten was a half day. Okay, so she had a completely different set of kids the second half of the day. Well, anyway, so I'm there early in the morning. The second half of the day, I was transferred to a sixth grade. But here she had all this gallon of buttons of all different sizes and shapes and colors. And she says, well, I have these buttons. I wish you could do some kind of an art project with the kids. Okay, well, so what happened is I had some cards, some tagboard paper cards that were, like 11 by 14. And I would draw a subject, a cartoon on that page, and then they would go and glue with Elmer's glue those buttons. So you had a big turtle crawling across the floor, and they would make his shell out of buttons, and butterflies and princesses with their crowns, and all that kind of stuff. These kids decorated everything I drew with the buttons, and of course the Elmer's glue hadn't dry, so we set them in the windowsill for them to dry, and then they went off and went on home and left them there. Well, the afternoon group got in there and saw what the morning group had done, and they were absolutely, adamant that they had it. So the first thing you knew, here I was in the sixth grade, and in second grade, the first kindergarten teacher was standing there at the door with the principal, and so he got to be the substitute. Well, I went down to her room and did a button lesson with the afternoon class. But that was kind of fun, The principal was a real good guy about doing all kinds of supporting things. That was neat.